Hello everybody! In this Swift programming tutorial we're going to go over optionals. A quick definition. Optionals can be used in situations where a value may be absent. An optional represents two possibilities. Either there is a value or there is not a value. If there is a value, you can unwrap the optional to access that value. If there is not a value, the optional is equivalent to nil. So for our first example, let's just go over how you can create an optional. And we have done that here. So we have created a variable with the title alternate email, and it is of type string. And to make it an optional, we have put a question mark after the type. So let's go ahead and uncomment this print, and let's run this and see what the current value is for alternate email. Now, as we mentioned in our definition, if the optional does not have a value, it is set to nil. So you can see that down here in the console. You could also explicitly set that to nil, and you should get the same output. And we do. We get nil again. If we assign this optional a value, now our alternate email variable has an email address assigned to it. So let's go ahead and run it and see what we get. Okay, so you can see down here we get our email address. However, currently you can see that it says optional, and then in the round brackets we have our email. Now, to get rid of that optional or to unwrap that optional, there are several things that we can do. One way is to force unwrap that optional with the exclamation point, and we just put that after the variable name. So let's go ahead and run that, and that should get rid of this optional here. And now you can see we have force unwrapped that optional with the exclamation point, and now we just have the email. So that is one way that you can unwrap that optional. However, at times that can be just a little bit risky, because if you try to unwrap an optional that has no value, then your program could crash. So another way that we could get rid of that optional is to use two question marks and provide a default value. So let's just use two question marks and then say no alternate email available. So now let's go ahead and run this. And since we currently do have a value here, we get that value down in the console when we put the variable inside of a print. Now, if we get rid of the value and we try and print it, we should get our default value, no alternate email available. So let's go ahead and run it. And we get what we expected, since this variable here has no value currently. We get no alternate email available. Okay, moving on to example number 2, we have created a variable called alternate phone, and you can see currently the alternate phone number is a type string. So if we hover our cursor over this variable and hit Option and then click it, you can see it is an implicit type string. Now what we want to do is take that string and assign it to another variable and make it of type integer, and we can do that by using the int with the capital letters and putting it inside the round brackets. If we hold our cursor over this variable and use the Option key and click that, you can see that this variable is an optional, and you can tell that by the question mark here of type int. So let's go ahead and uncomment this print and run it and see what we get. Okay, so we get our phone number. However, it is an optional. And the reason that this is considered an optional is because not all strings will have an integer equivalent. So once again, we could force unwrap that to get rid of this optional in the round brackets. So let's go ahead and run that. And there we have our phone number. We could also use the double question marks and provide a default value. And for this default value, let's say no alternate phone number available. Let's run it, and you can see that we get our phone number without the optional in the round brackets. Now let's change this up a little bit, and let's just say for some reason we have to put some letters in this variable. And let's change our default here to say no int equivalent. Let's go ahead and run it. And you can see down here in the console we get back no int equivalent, because when we put the variable name here and wrapped it with the int, since there are now letters in this string, there would be no int equivalent. Okay, moving on to example number 3. If you create a variable and at any point in time you think that it will not have a value, you want to make sure that you make it an optional. And again, you can do that by putting a question mark after the type. So let's uncomment our print here. Let's run this and see what we currently get. Okay, so we get no value, and the reason for that is we created our variable, we made it an optional, we assigned it a value, but then we set that variable to nil, and then when we put our variable in our print to display, just in case it did not have a value, we used our double question marks and provided a default value. If we comment this out and run it, we get 1. Okay, so that's the value we assigned it. However, if we originally created this variable and it was not an optional, and then at some point we try to set it to nil, it's not going to work. So we get all kinds of error messages and all that good stuff. Okay, so the takeaway from this example is, if you think that your variable will ever need to be nil or have no value, you want to go ahead and create it as an optional. Moving on to our example number 4. Oftentimes, you will need to be able to test your variable to see if it is nil. Now, the way we have done that, here we have created our variable. It is an optional of type int. Then we use an if statement, and we test that variable, and we use not equal to nil. So if that variable is not nil and it has a value, then it is going to display this message. Otherwise, if it has no value and it is nil, it's going to display this message. So currently, this variable has no value. So it should display this message, no value. Let's go ahead and run it. And you can see we get no value down in the console. Now, if we go ahead and assign a value, let's just make it 100 and run it. We should get back has a value. And we do. We're good to go. So one of the main takeaways from this example is, if you ever need to test your variable and make sure that it's not nil before you do something, this is one way to do it. So you basically say, if the optional is not nil, do something, otherwise do something else. Okay, up next is example number 5. Now, a cool little thing, if your indentations are not correct, you can select your code and hit Control-I, and that should re-indent everything correctly. Now, in one of our previous examples, we briefly showed how you can force unwrap. However, if you're going to force unwrap, as we mentioned, you typically don't want to force unwrap if there's no value assigned to your variable because it will crash. Okay, so we have created a variable here. It is an optional of type string. Then we went ahead and assigned a value to that variable. And if we use a print to display that greeting, let's comment out this print, we will get the greeting, but you can see we get the optional in the round brackets. So let's go ahead and delete that. And one way that we can force unwrap that, but to make sure that it is safe to force unwrap that, is to use the if greeting not equal nil and use the exclamation point to force unwrap it. And that will get rid of this optional and the round brackets. So let's go ahead and run it. And you can see we get our greeting down in the console. Okay, so the main takeaway from this example is you usually want to do some type of check to check for nil before you force unwrap. Okay, for example number 6, we're going to go over optional binding. And when you use optional binding, you want to think if let. So what optional binding does is it binds your value, if it's available, to a temporary constant or variable for use, and if the optional is nil, the code is skipped. So we have created a variable here. We've called it SumString. It is an optional of type string. Then we've gone ahead and assigned the variable a value. Then we use our optional binding syntax, if let. Then we create a temporary variable name, and in this case it's a temporary constant name, with the title SumString has a value. Then we assign our SumString variable, and then in the curly brackets we use a print to display the value, if it is available. Okay, so let's just quickly go over that one more time to explain what's happening here. So if SumString has a value, we're going to assign that value to this temporary constant here. Then we can use it within our curly brackets. If SumString does not have a value, then this code is basically skipped, and this should be a safe way to test your variable for a value and to try and make sure that your program doesn't crash. So let's go ahead and run this. And you can see down here in the console, we get our greeting. It's going to be a wonderful day. Now let's see what happens if we assign this nil. Let's run it. And what happens is basically nothing happens. This code is skipped, just as we expected, okay? Okay, moving on to our last example. Example number 7, we're going to go over how you can use what's equivalent to multiple if-lets. Okay, so in this example, we're going to test to see if we have what we need to go for a run. So we have 3 criteria, and 2 of the criteria are optionals. And the main things we're concerned with is we need our running shoes and a drink to go for our run, okay? We've also added a Boolean here to make sure that it's not raining, because if it's raining, we don't want to go for our run. So we created our 3 variables, running shoes, drink, and is raining. The first 2 are the optionals of type string, and the third Boolean is whether it's raining or not. Then we've gone ahead and we've assigned our values. So we do have our running shoes. They're Nike running shoes. We have our drink. It's a Gatorade. And it is currently not raining. Now, one thing to notice, when you use the if-let and you use multiple lets and or multiple criteria, if any of them are false, then the whole thing is false, okay? So we've used our if-let syntax, and we've used our running shoes, and we have created our temporary constant. We've assigned our running shoes variable. So if the running shoes variable has a value, we're going to assign it to this for temporary use. We did the same thing with our drink, and we put in our Boolean raining variable. So let's go ahead and run this and see what we currently get. Okay, so we created a print here, and we used some string interpolation, and we put in our running shoes and our drink. And our current message reads, grab your Nike running shoes and Gatorade and let's go for a run. Now let's say that we forgot our running shoes. So let's go ahead and set this equal to nil. And as we mentioned, if anything evaluates to false or nil, then we should get this else here. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. And we get what we expected. We get the print with the else, stay inside and walk on the treadmill. Okay, so the takeaway from this optional example number 7 is you can use multiple if-lets. So in this example, we've said if-let, we create our temporary constant. If running shoes is not nil, assign that to this variable for use. Then we did the same thing with the drink, and we added an extra criteria with a Boolean here. But these 2 are the optionals, and if they all have a value, then you can use those values in your curly brackets. If any of them are nil, then you want to create an else and deal with those variables appropriately. Okay, so that's all we have for this tutorial on the basics of Swift optionals. We will be doing many more Swift tutorials in the near future. Join us for those, and we'll see you next time.